I always believed that love meant loyalty, especially when it came to marriage. My husband Daniel and I had been together for 14 years. We built everything side by side: a home in Sarasota, a small boat rental business, and a modest but growing retirement plan. We didn't have children, but we had each other. Or so I thought. I met Daniel when I was just out of college. I was managing a front desk at a local resort, and he came in, sun-kissed, confident, with that charming grin that could melt ice. He was 7 years older and already had his own little boat tour business. What started with shared laughs turned into years of building a life together. I wasn't naive. I knew Daniel came from money. His parents lived in a big house by the bay, and his older brother had an investment firm in Miami. But Daniel always claimed he wanted to do things on his own, without their influence. That's part of why I loved him. We weren't flashy. We worked hard. We made decisions together. Or, that's what I thought. Things changed when Daniel got sick. It was sudden. Just weeks after his 44th birthday, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Everything unraveled so quickly. The man who once joked about never needing a doctor was now too weak to walk across our kitchen. I became his caretaker, his emotional anchor, the one holding it all together while his family came and went with pitying looks and shallow reassurances. During those months, I barely slept. I handled the bills, the meds, the doctors, and the endless paperwork. His family offered little help, but I didn't complain. I loved Daniel. I was doing what any wife would do, right? One night, while he was resting, I overheard his brother Paul whispering to him in the living room. I stayed hidden just behind the hallway. Paul said something that sent a chill down my spine. "You need to make sure everything's handled before it's too late. You don't want any legal mess, especially with her." Her? Did he mean me? I froze. My stomach tightened. I wanted to believe I misheard, that maybe he meant someone else. But the way Daniel sighed, the way he didn't correct him, I knew something was off. Still, I pushed the doubt away. I told myself that grief and illness made people speak strangely. I stayed by Daniel's side until the very end, and when he passed, I mourned him with every ounce of my heart. What I didn't know was that while I was losing my husband, I was also losing everything else. Because behind my back, Daniel made a decision. A final, cruel betrayal. And I was about to find out just how deep that betrayal went. The day of the reading of Daniel's will, I showed up in my black dress, still deep in mourning. I hadn't even begun to process life without him. I thought this would be a formality, maybe a few final details to settle, maybe a letter he left me, something personal, something that said, "I love you, thank you for being there." I wasn't expecting riches. I wasn't expecting surprises, just acknowledgement. Instead, I got silence, cold, brutal silence. The lawyer, Mr. Corwin, looked uneasy from the moment I walked in. Daniel's family was already seated, his mother dabbing her eyes dramatically, his brother Paul smirking like he already knew what was coming. The room reeked of expensive cologne and quiet triumph. Mr. Corwin cleared his throat and began to read. "To my wife Megan, I leave my love and appreciation for the years we shared. May she find peace." I blinked. That was it. No house, no business, no savings, just words. Empty, gutting words. My heart pounded as the rest of the will was read. Daniel had left everything. Our home, the business we'd built together, even the boat we used for sunset tours, to Paul. Not even to his parents. To his brother. The same brother who only visited when it was convenient. The same man who once said my working-class background was an embarrassment to their family. And now he owned everything I helped create. I couldn't breathe. I felt the walls close in around me. I tried to speak, to question it, but Mr. Corwin just looked down, avoiding my eyes. Afterward, Paul approached me like he was the hero of the hour. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," he said with a voice full of fake sympathy. But Daniel didn't want complications. You know how emotional you get. He thought this was for the best. I stood frozen. Was I hearing this right? He continued, "Look, I'll give you a few weeks to pack up. I don't want to make things harder than they need to be." Pack up? That was my home. That was our business. And I was being erased from all of it. Just like that, I left that office shaking. The grief over Daniel's death had barely begun, and now I was being told that none of what we built belonged to me, that he'd handed it all over with a few strokes of a pen. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, that maybe Daniel wasn't thinking clearly, that someone had pressured him, manipulated him when he was weak. But the more I dug, the more it became clear. This wasn't an accident. This was a setup, and if they thought I would just disappear quietly, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The first few days after the will reading felt like drowning in slow motion. I stayed in what was technically now Paul's house, surrounded by memories of Daniel, unsure if I should cry for the man I lost or the betrayal he left behind. I barely slept. My mind was spinning with questions. How could Daniel do this? Why would he cut me out? Was this even legal? I started with the obvious. I pulled out every folder, every document we kept. Our tax returns, the original deed to the house, the business incorporation papers. And then something odd stood out. Our business, Salt and Sun Tours, had been quietly restructured 6 months before Daniel passed. I never signed anything. Daniel had moved my name off the ownership. I was stunned. I went to the county clerk's office the next day and requested the paperwork. Sure enough, there it was. An updated LLC agreement, signed only by Daniel and a witness. The witness, Paul? My stomach turned. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was orchestrated. That night, I dug deeper. I remembered that Daniel kept a fireproof safe in our closet. I hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. He'd changed the combination a year ago after a scare with his identity being stolen, and I never asked for the new code. At the time, I trusted him. Now I regretted it. I stood in front of that safe and whispered out loud, "What would you pick, Daniel?" I tried every date I could think of, his birthday, our anniversary, even the day we bought the boat. Nothing worked. But then I tried Paul's birthday. The door clicked open. Inside was a mess of documents. A second version of the will, dated months before the one that was read, was sitting there. In this version, I was the sole beneficiary. Everything was left to me, exactly as we had always discussed. My hands shook as I read it. So what changed? Why was this hidden? And that's when I noticed a detail, something so small but so telling. The newer version, the one that left everything to Paul, had a notary seal from a private firm in Miami, the same firm Paul used for his real estate deals. I suddenly saw it all, the timing, the pressure, the manipulation. Daniel had been sick, vulnerable. Paul had used that, probably whispering in his ear, playing on his fears, controlling the narrative, maybe even threatening him in ways I didn't yet know. But there was one thing Paul hadn't counted on. Me. I wasn't going to roll over and fade away, not for him, not for anyone. If they wanted to play dirty, I was ready to dig even deeper. And I had just found my first piece of ammunition. The next morning, I walked into a small law office in downtown Sarasota with a folder full of documents and a heart pounding in my chest. I had never sued anyone before. I had never even threatened legal action. But this wasn't just about money. This was about being erased. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I met with a probate attorney named Valerie Chen. She was sharp, calm, and didn't talk down to me. After listening to my story, she asked one simple question. Do you want justice, Megan, or revenge? I didn't even have to think. Justice, I said. But I want the truth out in the open. Valerie nodded. Then we need to be smart, methodical, and very, very careful. Over the next few weeks, we started gathering everything. Emails, text messages, witness statements. Valerie submitted a motion to challenge the will's validity based on undue influence. That phrase would become my mantra: undue influence. A legal term for what I knew in my gut had happened. Daniel had been manipulated. It was a delicate process. We needed to prove that Daniel wasn't acting of his own free will when he signed the second will, that he was pressured, coerced, and that he lacked the mental clarity at the time to truly understand the consequences. That's where things got interesting. One of the hospice nurses, a woman named Linda, had been with Daniel regularly during his final weeks. When Valerie interviewed her, Linda broke down and said something I'll never forget. Daniel was scared, not of dying, of his brother. Paul would visit when you weren't home, Megan. He'd close the door, and afterward Daniel would be shaking. He once told me, "He's forcing me to change it, but I don't want to hurt her." That testimony was gold, and it gave me something even more valuable: validation. I hadn't imagined it. I wasn't just some grieving widow clinging to fantasy. Daniel had been scared. He had wanted to protect me. He just didn't have the strength to fight Paul in the end. But I did. Valerie filed the petition to contest the will. Paul, of course, responded with fury, his lawyer accusing me of being bitter and money-hungry, which was rich coming from the guy who stole an entire estate behind my back. Things were about to get messy. Paul was already sending me letters demanding I vacate his property. But I stayed put. I wasn't going to be intimidated out of my home. Not again. The court date was set. I had months to prepare. And while they were busy underestimating me, I was getting stronger. One thing became clear during that time. I might have lost Daniel, but I hadn't lost my voice. And now I was going to use it. The day of the first hearing, I stood outside the courthouse in a simple black blazer and slacks, my hands clutching a leather folder of documents like a lifeline. Valerie stood beside me, calm and focused. I didn't feel powerful. I felt like I was holding myself together with string. But I was there. I showed up. Paul arrived 15 minutes late with a smug expression and a lawyer who looked like he was billing by the second. Paul didn't even glance my way. He walked past like I was a stranger. Maybe that's how he saw me now. An obstacle, not a person. Not the woman who cared for his dying brother when he couldn't be bothered to show up. The judge was an older man named Judge Rollins, firm but fair. He made it clear from the beginning that this wouldn't be a dramatic courtroom showdown, at least not yet. This was a preliminary hearing, just to establish grounds. But even that meant everything. If the judge believed we had a case, we could proceed to discovery, depositions, a full trial. Valerie opened with a calm, measured statement. She explained the timing of the will change, the conflict of interest with Paul's involvement, the presence of a previous will that had been hidden, and most importantly, the statement from the hospice nurse. Linda's account that Daniel was pressured, scared, and not mentally sound. Paul's lawyer scoffed. He said Daniel was of sound mind and heart, that he loved his brother and felt neglected by his wife, that Daniel's decision to change the will had been rational and clear. I nearly choked. Neglected? I had spent sleepless nights cleaning bedpans and fighting insurance companies while Paul was drinking cocktails in Miami. But in that courtroom, I kept my face still. I had to. Then the judge looked at me and said, "Mrs. Porter, do you have anything to say?" I took a breath. My voice wavered at first. "Your Honor, I loved my husband. I cared for him every day for months while he was sick. I watched him waste away. I watched him cry. And I watched his brother walk in here today like he earned something." I paused, feeling the weight of the room shift. Daniel was manipulated. He was scared. And I believe he would be horrified if he knew what was being done in his name. There was a silence that stretched longer than it should have. Then Judge Rollins nodded slowly. "I believe this warrants further investigation. I'll allow discovery." That moment, those 5 words, felt like a door cracking open after being locked in the dark. Paul's mask slipped just a little. His jaw clenched. He looked at me for the first time in weeks, and I could see the panic behind his eyes. He thought I would fold. He thought I would disappear quietly. He was wrong. I wasn't backing down. Not when the truth was finally stepping into the light. Once the court allowed us to move forward, everything shifted. Paul had been so sure of himself, so confident that no one would challenge him, but now, every document, every conversation, every action was being pulled apart under a microscope. And the cracks started to show. Valerie subpoenaed emails between Daniel and Paul from the final months. Most of the messages were mundane, but a few stood out. One in particular where Paul wrote, "You need to lock this down before the end of the month. Don't let your emotions ruin this." That was dated just a week before the updated will. Then came the bank records. Paul had transferred a significant sum, $25,000, 0 cents, from one of Daniel's personal accounts into a private account in Miami. The transaction was flagged because it happened 3 days before the will was changed. Valerie raised it as evidence of potential coercion or quid pro quo. But the most damning moment came from a surprise witness, someone I hadn't expected to hear from at all. It was Marlene, Daniel's cousin. She hadn't been involved in our lives much, but she reached out after reading a small article in the local paper about the court dispute. She said she needed to speak with me in person. We met at a quiet cafe in Bradenton, and I could tell she was nervous. She kept fidgeting with her teacup before finally saying, "I visited Daniel a few days before he passed. He told me he regretted everything." I blinked. "Regretted what?" She leaned in. He said, "Paul made me sign something. I didn't want to, but I was tired. I just wanted peace. He said he wanted to fix it, but didn't know how. I thought it was family drama at the time, so I stayed out of it. But now, I think he was asking for help." I could barely hold back tears. That moment changed everything for me. Not just legally, but emotionally. It confirmed what my gut had known all along. Daniel didn't want to betray me. He wasn't a monster. He was a sick, vulnerable man who got cornered by someone he trusted. Paul. And that changed the narrative, from a greedy widow trying to overturn a will to a woman seeking justice for a man who had been silenced. The pressure was mounting. Paul's lawyers tried to drag things out, filing motions to delay, throwing up procedural roadblocks. But they were losing control. They even offered me a private settlement, something quiet, off the books. A lump sum to just move on. But I didn't want their money. I wanted the truth on record. I wanted the legacy Daniel and I built to be honored. I wanted Paul exposed, not just for what he did to me, but for what he did to his own brother. So I said no. And just like that, the battle lines were redrawn. Trial was officially on the calendar. I could feel it coming. The storm. And I was no longer afraid of it. It took the judge 2 weeks to make a ruling. 2 weeks of waiting, wondering, rereading every piece of testimony in my mind. 2 weeks of people telling me to just let it go or move on. But when you've been erased by the person you loved most, moving on isn't about forgetting. It's about reclaiming your place in the story. When the ruling finally came in, I was at Valerie's office. She opened the envelope silently, read through the judge's statement, then looked at me and smiled. "Megan, the judge ruled in your favor." I froze. "What does that mean? Like, really? Mean?" She leaned in. "It means the second will is invalid." Paul's influence was found to be coercive. The court is restoring the original will, the one that named you as sole beneficiary. I felt the air rush out of me. For a second, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, stunned. After all the lies, the isolation, the gaslighting, someone had finally seen the truth. The house was mine. The business was mine. The life Daniel and I built, it was acknowledged, not erased, not handed off like a transaction. Paul tried to appeal, of course, but the ruling was strong and the evidence was overwhelming. His own actions, his greed, had done most of the damage. Eventually, he backed off. Quietly, bitterly. I heard he sold his Miami condo not long after. He disappeared from Sarasota. I haven't seen him since. And honestly, I don't need to. Justice didn't mean ruining him. It meant reclaiming me. Today, I still run Salt and Sun tours. I added a new evening package, legacy rides, sunset cruises dedicated to loved ones lost, where people can share memories and scatter ashes if they wish. It's peaceful, healing. Exactly what I needed. Daniel, he made a mistake at the end, a devastating one, but I've made peace with that. I believe he was scared, vulnerable, and he didn't know how to fight back. But I did. And I did it not just for me, but for every woman who's ever been told to sit quietly while the men decide what she's worth. To those women, I say, don't. Don't be quiet. Don't be small. Don't let someone else write your ending. Because forgiveness is a choice. And sometimes, justice is the only one worth making.